Chapter 5. The Bird Fights Its Way Out of the Egg. My painted dream bird was on the way looking for my friend. In the strangest way, an answer came to me. In my school class at my place, I once found a note stuck in my book after the break between two lessons. It was folded in the same way as our custom when classmates sometimes secretly send each other tickets during a lesson. I was just surprised who sent me such a note, as I had never been in such contact with any of my classmates. I figured it was going to be an invitation to some school fun that I wasn't going to be a part of, so I put the note unread in the front of my book. Only during lesson did it actually fall into my hands again. I played with the paper, thoughtlessly unfolding it, and found some words written on it. I looked at it, got stuck on a word, got a fright, and read, my heart clenching with fate as if it were very cold. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. If you want to be born, you have to destroy a world. The bird flies to God. The God is called Abraxas. I sank into deep contemplation after reading these lines several times. There was no doubt possible it was Demian's answer. No one could know about the bird but me and him. He got my picture. He understood and helped me interpret. But how was everything connected? And that bothered me most of all. What did Abraxas mean? I had never heard or read the word. The god's name is Abraxas. The hour passed without my hearing anything about the lesson. The next began, the last in the morning. It was given by a very young assistant teacher, just out of university, who we liked because he was so young and didn't assume any false dignity towards us. We read Herodotus under Dr. Fallen's guidance. This reading was one of the few school subjects that interested me, but this time I wasn't there. I had opened my book mechanically, but didn't follow the translation and remained lost in my thoughts. Incidentally, I had experienced several times how correct what Demian had said to me in spiritual instruction was. Whatever you wanted hard enough, you succeeded. If I was very busy with my own thoughts during the lesson, I could rest assured that the teacher would leave me alone. Yes, if you were distracted or sleepy, he would suddenly appear. I've had that too. But if you really thought, really sunk, then you were protected. And I had already tried and found it tried and tested with the fixed sight. Back then, in Demian's time, it was me. I didn't succeed. Now I often felt that one could achieve a great deal with looks and thoughts. That's how I sat too, far from Herodotus and from school. But suddenly the teacher's voice struck me like lightning, and I woke up in a fright. I heard his voice. He was standing right next to me. I thought he had called my name, but he didn't look at me. I breathed a sigh of relief. Then I heard his voice again. Aloud he said the word, Abraxas. In a statement, the beginning of which escaped me, Dr. Fallen went on, we need not imagine the views of those sects and mystical societies of antiquity so naively as they appear from the standpoint of rationalistic consideration. Antiquity had no science at all in our sense. Instead, there was a preoccupation with philosophical, mystical truths that was very highly developed. In part, this resulted in magic and gimmicks, which often led to fraud and crime. But magic also had a noble origin and deep thoughts. Such is the teaching of Abraxas, which I gave as an example earlier. This name is mentioned in connection with Greek magic formulas, and often takes it for the name of some magic devil, such as wild people still have today. But it seems that Abraxas means much more. We can think of the name as that of a deity who had the symbolic task of uniting the divine and the devil. The little learned man continued to speak elegantly and eagerly, but no one paid much attention, and since the name no longer appeared, my attention soon sank back into itself. Unite the divine and the devilish, I echoed. I was able to connect here. I was familiar with that from our conversations with Demian in the very last days of our friendship. Demian said at the time that we do have a god that we worship, but that he only represents an arbitrarily separated half of the world. It was the official, permitted light world. But you have to be able to worship the whole world, so you either have to have a god who is also the devil, or you have to set up a service for the devil in addition to worship. And now Abraxas was the god who is both good and devil. For a while I sought it out with great zeal, and continued on the track without making any progress. I also rummaged through an entire library for the Abraxas without success, but my being was never so strongly attuned to this kind of direct and conscious search, whereby one usually finds truths that remain a stone in the hand. The figure of Beatrice, with which I had been occupied so much and intimately for a certain time, now gradually sank under, Or rather, she slowly stepped away from me, approached the horizon more and more, and became more shadowy, distant, paler. It was no longer enough for the soul. A new formation began to emerge in the existence that was peculiarly spun into myself, and that I led like a dream walker. The longing for life blossomed in me, or rather the longing for love, and the sex drive, which I had been able to resolve for a while into the adoration of Beatrice, demanded new images and goals. Still no fulfillment came my way, and it was more impossible than ever for me to deceive my longing and expect something from the girls with whom my comrades sought their happiness. I dreamed again, violent, more during the day than at night. Ideas, images, or desires arose in me and pulled me away from the outside world, so that I dealt and lived with these images in me, with these dreams or shadows more real and lively than with my real surroundings. A certain dream or fantasy that kept recurring became meaningful to me. This dream, the most important, most lasting one of my life, was something like this. I returned to my father's house. Above the door was the heraldic bird, shown in yellow on a blue background. In the house, my mother came towards me, but when I entered and wanted to hug her, it wasn't her, but an unseen figure, tall and powerful, similar to Max Demian and my painted sheet, but different, and in spite of its power, completely feminine. This figure pulled me close and embraced me in a deep, shuddering embrace of love. Delight and horror were mixed. The embrace was worship and crime at the same time. Too many memories of my mother, too many memories of my friend Demian haunted the figure that surrounded me, violated all reverence, and yet was bliss. I often awoke from this dream with a deep feeling of happiness, often with a fear of death and a tormented conscience as if from a terrible sin. Only gradually and unconsciously did a connection come about between this very inner picture and the hint that I received from outside about the God to be sought. But then it became closer and more intimate, and I began to feel that I was invoking Abraxas precisely in this institutional dream. Delight and horror, man and woman mixed, the holiest and the ugly intertwined, deep guilt twitching through the tenderest innocence. Such was my dream of love, and so was Abraxas. Love was no longer a dark animal impulse, as I had felt when I was anxious at first. It was also no longer pious, spiritualized worship, as I offered it to the image of Beatrice. She was both and much more. She was an image of an angel and Satan, man and woman in one, human and animal, supreme good and supreme evil. To live this seemed destined to me, to taste my fate. I longed for him and was afraid of him. I dreamed about him and I fled from him, but it was always there, always over me. Next spring I was supposed to leave high school and go to university. I didn't know where or what yet. A small beard grew on my lips. I was a full-grown human being, and yet completely helpless and aimless. Only one thing was certain, the voice within me, the dream image. I felt the task of following this guidance blindly. But it was difficult for me, and I rebelled every day. Maybe I was crazy, I often thought. Maybe I wasn't like other people. But I could also do everything that others did. With a little diligence and effort I could read Plato, solve trigonometric problems, or follow a chemical analysis. There was only one thing I couldn't do. Tear out the goal hidden in me and draw it somewhere in front of me, like others did who knew exactly what they wanted, to be a professor or a judge or a doctor or an artist, how long it would take and what benefits would be. I couldn't do that. Maybe I became one too, but how was I to know? Maybe I had to search and keep searching for years and didn't get anywhere. Perhaps I also reached a goal, but it was a bad, dangerous, terrible one. All I wanted to do was to try to live what wanted to come out of me of its own accord. Why was that so very difficult? I often attempted to paint the mighty love figure in my dreams, but it never worked. If I had succeeded, I would have sent the sheet to Demian. Where was he? I did not know it. All I knew was that he was connected to me. When would I see him again? The friendly calm of those weeks and months of Beatrice's time was long gone. At that time I thought I had reached an island and found peace. But it was always like that. No sooner had a condition become dear to me, no sooner had a dream done me good, than it became withered and blind. In vain to complain after him. I lived now in a fire of unsatisfied desire, of tense anticipation that often drove me completely wild and mad. I often saw the image of the dream lover before me with surviving clarity, much clearer than my own hand, spoke to him, cried in front of him, cursed at him. I called her mother and knelt before her in tears. I called her beloved and sensed her ripe, all-fulfilling kiss. I called her devil and whore, vampire and murderer. It tempted me to the tenderest dreams of love and to the wild shamelessness. Nothing was too good and delicious for him, nothing too bad and mean. I spent that whole winter in an inner storm that is difficult to describe. I had often been accustomed to loneliness. It didn't oppress me. I lived with Demian, with the sparrowhawk, with the image of the great dream figure that was my destiny and my lover. That was enough to live in, for everything looked far and wide, and everything pointed to Abraxas. But none of these dreams, none of my thoughts, obeyed me. None could I summon, none could I give colors at will. They came and took me. I was ruled by them, lived by them. I was safe from the outside world. I wasn't afraid of people. My classmates had learned that too, and they showed me a secret respect that often made me smile. If I wanted to, I could see through most of them very well, and occasionally astound them. I rarely, if ever, wanted to. I was always busy with myself, always myself, and I yearned longingly to finally live a bit, something to give myself out to the world, to relate and fight with it. Sometimes when I was walking through the streets in the evening and couldn't return home until midnight because I was restless, sometimes I thought my beloved had to meet me now and then, walk past the next corner, call me out of the next window. Sometimes all this seemed unbearably painful to me, and I was prepared to take my own life one day. I found a strange refuge at that time, by accident as they say, but there are no such coincidences. When someone who needs something finds what he needs, it is not chance that gives it to him, but he himself, his own desire and need leads him there. I had overheard organ playing from a smaller suburban church 2 or 3 times on my walks around town without stopping. The next time I passed, I heard it again and realized that Bach was being played. I went to the gate, which I found closed, and since the street was almost deserted, I sat down on a curb next to the church, pulled my coat collar around me, and listened. It was not a great organ, but it was a good one, and it played oddly, namely well and almost virtuously, but with a peculiar, highly personal expression of will and perseverance that sounded like a prayer. It had the feeling. The man who is playing knows that there is a treasure locked away in this music, and he courts and bangs and strives for this treasure as he does for his life. Technically, I don't understand very much about music, but I've instinctively understood this expression of the soul since I was a child and felt that music was something natural in me. The musician also played something modern on it. It could have been by Rieger. The church was almost completely dark, only a very thin ray of light filtered through the nearest window. I waited for the music to end, then swept up and down until I saw the organist come out. He was still a young man, but older than me, square and stocky of build, and he ran away quickly with strong and as if it were unwilling strides. From then on, I sometimes sat in front of the church in the evening or walked up and down. Once I also found the gate open, and sat shivering and happy in the pews for half an hour while the organist played upstairs in the dim gaslight. From the music he played, I not only heard him himself. Everything he played seemed to be related to each other, to have a secret connection. Everything he played was religious, devoted, and pious, but not pious like churchgoers and pastors, but pious like pilgrims and beggars in the Middle Ages, pious with ruthless devotion to a feeling for the world that stood above all creeds. The masters before Bach were played diligently, and old Italians, and everyone said the same thing. Everyone said that the musician had in his soul longing, deepest grasping of the world, and wildest parting from it, burning listening to his own dark soul, intoxication of devotion and deep curiosity about the wonderful. Once when I was secretly following the organist after he left the church, I saw him enter a small tavern far away on the outskirts of town. I couldn't resist and went after him. For the first time I saw him clearly here. He was sitting at the innkeeper's table in a corner of the small room, his black felt hat on his head, a glass of wine in front of him, and his face was just as I had expected. It was ugly and a bit wild, searching and obstinate and willful, and at the same time soft and childlike in his mouth. The masculine and strong was all in the eyes and forehead. The lower part of his face was delicate and unfinished, uncontrolled and partly soft. The chin, full of indecision, stood there boyishly like a contradiction to forehead and gaze. I loved the dark brown eyes, full of pride and hostility. I sat down across from him in silence. No one else was in the pub. He glared at me like he was going to chase me away. However, I held my ground and kept looking at him until he growled angrily. "What are you looking at so damn sharply? Do you want something from me?" "I don't want anything from you," I said, "but I've had a lot from you." He frowned. "So, you are a music lover. I find it disgusting to have a crush on music." I wasn't deterred. "I've listened to you many times in that church out there," I said. "By the way, I don't want to bother you. I thought I might find something with you, something special. I'm not quite sure what. But you'd better listen not on me. I can listen to you in church." "I always lock up." "You forgot the other day and I was sitting inside. Otherwise I stand outside or sit on the curb." "So? You can come in another time, it's warmer. All you have to do then is knock on the door, but strong, and not while I'm playing. Now, what were you going to say? You are a very young man, probably a schoolboy or student. Are you a musician?" "No, I like listening to music, but only music like the one you play. Absolutely unconditional music. Music when you can feel that a person is shaking heaven and hell. I love music very much. I think because it is so unmoral. Everything else is moral, and I'm looking for something that isn't. I've always just suffered from the moral. I can't express myself well. Do you know that there must be a God who is both God and the devil? There was supposed to be one. I heard about it." The musician pushed back his wide hat a little and shook his dark hair from his large forehead. He saw me piercingly and leaned his face toward me across the table. Quietly and tensely he asked, "What is the name of the God you are talking about?" "Unfortunately, I know next to nothing about him. Actually just his name. His name is Abraxas." The musician looked around suspiciously as if someone might be overhearing us. Then he moved close to me and said in a whisper, "I thought so. Who are you?" "I'm a high school student." "How do you know about Abraxas?" "Randomly." He banged on the table so that his wineglass spilled over. "Coincidence? Don't talk dirt, young man. You don't know about Abraxas by accident. Remember that. I'll tell you more about him. I know a little bit about him." He said nothing and pushed back his chair. When I looked at him expectantly, he grimaced. "Not here. Another time. There, take it." He reached into the pocket of his coat that he hadn't pulled down and pulled out some roasted chestnuts, which he threw at me. I said nothing, took them, and ate them, and was very satisfied. "So," he whispered after a while, "how do you know about him?" I didn't hesitate to tell him. "I was alone and at a loss," I said. It reminded me of a friend from years past who I think knows a great deal. I had painted something, a bird coming out of a globe. I sent that to him. After a while, when I no longer really believed in it, I was given a piece of paper that said, "The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. If you want to be born, you have to destroy a world. The bird flies to God. The God is called Abraxas." He said nothing. We peeled our chestnuts and ate them with the wine. "Shall we have another pint?" he asked. "No thanks, I don't like to drink." He laughed, a little disappointed. "As they want. It's different with me. I'm still staying here. Now just go." Then the next time after, the organ music went with him. He wasn't very forthcoming. He led me up an old lane through an old, stately house into a large, somewhat gloomy and unkept room, where nothing but a piano suggested music, while a large bookcase and desk gave the room a scholarly quality. "How many books you have," I said appreciatively. "Some of it is from my father's library, who I live with." "Yes, young man, I live with my father and mother, but I cannot introduce you to them. My company is not held in high esteem here in the house. I am a prodigal son, you know. My father is a fabulously honorable man, and a prominent pastor and preacher in a local town, and I, just so you know straight away, am his talented and promising son who has gone haywire and somewhat insane. I was a theologian and left this conservative faculty shortly before the state examination, although I'm actually still on the subject as far as my private studies are concerned. What kind of gods people have come up with is still extremely important and interesting to me. Moreover, I'm a musician now, and it seems I'll be getting a minor job as an organist soon. Then I'll be back in the church." I looked along the spines of the books, found Greek, Latin, Hebrew titles as far as I could see in the dim light of the small table lamp. In the meantime, my acquaintance lay down on the floor by the wall in the dark and was busy there. "Come on," he called after a while. Let's practice a little philosophy, that is, shut up, lie on your stomach, and think." He struck a match and lit paper and logs in the fireplace in front of which he lay. The flame rose high, and he stoked and fed the fire with exquisite care. I lay down with him on the tattered carpet. He stared into the fire, which attracted me too, and we lay silently for an hour on our stomachs in front of the flickering wood fire, watching it blaze and roar, sink and squirm, flicker and twitch, and finally brood in quiet, sunken embers on the ground. "Fire worshipping wasn't the stupidest thing that's been invented," he once murmured to himself. Otherwise, neither of us said a word. I clung to the fire with staring eyes, sank into a dream and silence, saw figures in the smoke and images in the ashes. I startled once. My comrade threw a piece of resin on the embers. A small, slender flame shot up. I saw in it the bird with the yellow sparrowhawk's head. In the dying embers of the chimney, golden glowing threads ran together to form a net. Letters and pictures appeared, memories of faces, of animals, of plants, of worms and snakes. When, waking up, I looked at the other, he was staring, chin on fists, devoted and fanatical into the ashes. "I have to go now," I said softly. "Yes, then go. Goodbye." He didn't get up, and since the lamp was out, I had to grope my way out of the enchanted old house through the dark room and the dark corridors and stairs. I stopped in the street and looked up at the old house. There were no lights on in any window. A small brass sign gleamed in the gaslight outside the door. "Pistorius, Chief Priest," I read on it. Only when I got home after dinner, sitting alone in my little room, I remembered that I hadn't heard anything about Abraxas or anything else from Pistorius, that we had hardly exchanged 10 words at all. But I was very satisfied with my visit to him, and for the next time he had promised me a very exquisite piece of organ music, a Passacaglia by Buxtehude. Without my knowing it, the organist Pistorius had given me my first lesson while I was lying with him on the floor of his gloomy hermitage in front of the fireplace. Looking into the fire had done me good. It had strengthened and confirmed tendencies in me that I had always had but never really cultivated. Gradually I became partially clear about it. Even as a small child, I had always had the tendency to look at bizarre forms of nature, not observing but surrendering to their own magic, their deep, crooked language. Long, lignified tree roots, colored veins in rocks, strains of oil floating on water, cracks in glass. All similar things had had great magic for me at times, especially the water and the fire, the smoke, the clouds, the dust, and especially the swirling patches of color I saw when I closed my eyes. In the days after my first visit to Pistorius, this began to come back to me, because I noticed that I owed a certain strengthening in joy, an increase in my feeling of myself, which I have felt since, only to staring into the open fire for a long time. It was strangely beneficial and enriching to do that. The few experiences that I had found on the way to my actual goal in life were joined by this new one. Looking at such structures, surrendering to the irrational, twisted, strange forms of nature creates in us a feeling of inner harmony with the will that let these creations come into being. We soon feel the temptation to take them for our own whims, for our own creations. We see the borders between us and nature tremble and dissolve, and get to know the mood in which we do not know whether the images on our retina come from external impressions or from internal ones. Nowhere as simply and easily as in this exercise do we make the discovery of how much we are creators, how much our soul always participates in the constant creation of the world. Rather, it is the same indivisible divinity that works in us and works in nature, and if the outer world were to perish, one of us would be able to rebuild it, for mountain and stream, tree and leaf, root and flower, all what is formed in nature is preformed in us, stems from the soul whose essence is eternity, whose essence we do not know, but which we mostly feel as the power of love and creativity. It was only a few years later that I found this observation confirmed in a book by Leonardo da Vinci, who spoke of how good and deeply stimulating it is to look at a wall on which many people have spat. In front of those stains on the damp wall, he felt the same as Pistorius and I had in front of the fire. The next time we were together, the organ player gave me an explanation. We always draw the boundaries of our personality far too narrowly. We always count as our person only that which we recognize as individually distinguished, as deviating. We pass but from all the parts of the world, each one of us, and just as our body carries the pedigree of development up to the fish and much further back, so we have in the soul everything that has ever lived in human souls, all the gods and devils that have ever existed, be it among the Greeks and Chinese or among the Zulu Kafirs, all with us, are there as possibilities, as wishes, as ways out. If mankind were to die out, except for a single halfway talented child who has had no instruction whatsoever, then this child would rediscover the whole course of things. It would have gods, demons, paradises, commandments and prohibitions, Old and New Testaments. Everything would be there again and could be produced. Yes, well, I objected. But then what is the worth of the individual? Why are we still striving when we already have everything ready within us? Stop, Pistorius shouted violently. There is a big difference between just carrying the world within you and knowing it too. A madman can produce thoughts reminiscent of Plato, and a pious little schoolboy in a Moravian institute thinks creatively about deep mythological connections that occur in the Gnostics or the Zoroaster. But he does not know about it. He is a tree or a stone, at best an animal until he knows it. But then, when the first spark of this knowledge dawns, then he becomes human. Surely you wouldn't take all the two-legged creatures walking down the street for human beings just because they walk upright and carry their young for 9 months. You see how many of them are fish or sheep, worms or leeches, how many ants, how many bees. Well, in each one of them the human possibilities are there, but only when he senses them, when he sometimes even learns to make them conscious. Do these possibilities belong to him? Our conversations were something like this. Rarely did they bring me anything entirely new, anything entirely surprising, but all of them, even the most banal, hit the same point in me with a soft, steady hammer blow. Everyone helped to form me. Everyone helped to peel off my skin, to break eggshells, and from each one I lifted my head a little higher, a little more freely, until my yellow Vogel pushed his beautiful raptor head out of the shattered world's shell. We often shared our dreams with each other. Pistorius knew how to give them an interpretation. I just remembered a wonderful example. I had a dream in which I could fly, but in such a way that I was, as it were, thrown through the air by a great momentum that I was not able to control. The feeling of this flight was exhilarating, but soon turned into fear as I found myself being torn to dangerous heights without my will. Then I made the redemptive discovery that I could regulate my rise and fall by holding and letting go of my breath. Pistorius said, "The momentum that makes you fly is our great human possession that everyone has. It is the feeling of being connected to the roots of every force. But it soon becomes frightening. It's damn dangerous. That's why most people are so willing to forego flying and prefer to walk the sidewalks in accordance with legal regulations. But not her. You fly on, as a good fellow should, and lo and behold you discover the wondrous thing, that you are gradually becoming master of it, and that in addition to the great general force that pulls you away, there is a fine, small force, an organ, a rudder. That's great. Without that, one would go with the will of the air. But that's what the insane do, for example. They are given deeper intuitions than the people on the sidewalk, but they have no key or rudder to go with them, and they rush into the abyss. But you, Sinclair, you do it. And how? Please. You probably don't know that yet. They do it with a new organ, a breathing regulator, and now you see how little personal your soul is in its depths. She does not invent this regulator. It's not new. It is a bond. It's existed for thousands of years. It is the balance organ of the fish, the swim bladder. In fact, there are still a few weird and conservative species of fish that still have a swim bladder that doubles as a kind of lung and may actually be used for breathing, so exactly like the lungs. He even brought me a volume of zoology and showed me names and pictures of those old-fashioned fish, and I felt, with a peculiar shudder, a function from early developmental epochs alive in me.